Harpo Studios in Chicago buzzed with pre-show energy. Technicians adjusted cameras and microphones with practiced efficiency. What was meant to be just another celebrity interview was about to become something else entirely. In the green room, Oprah Winfrey sat before a mirror while a makeup artist made final touches to her face. She wore a deep burgundy dress that photographed beautifully under studio lights. On the small table beside her, notes for the interview lay neatly organized, each talking point carefully researched and timed. Richard Sterling, the show's producer for the past 15 years, entered with his ever-present clipboard pressed against his chest like armor. At 52, he had built his career on understanding exactly what audiences wanted and delivering it with clockwork precision. 5 minutes. Ms. Winfrey, he said, his voice carrying practiced calm. Remember, we want this light and nostalgic. Hollywood stories. Behind-the-scenes anecdotes from his Western days. Keep it entertaining. Avoid religion, politics, anything too heavy. Oprah nodded. But something flickered in her eyes, a hesitation Richard couldn't quite read. He's not like other guests, she said quietly. Clint Eastwood doesn't do small talk. That's fine. You'll guide him. You always do. Richard checked his watch. Just keep the demographic happy. In the studio, 300 audience members filled the seats, their excited chatter creating a warm buzz. Among them, in the third row, sat two men who couldn't have been more different. Marcus Reynolds, 34, occupied his seat with restless energy. His tailored charcoal suit and expensive watch spoke of tech startup success. But his eyes carried a weariness no amount of money could hide. His phone rested in his hand, ready to capture whatever moments might prove shareable. Beside him sat Pastor Elijah Green, 70 years old, whose simple brown suit had seen many Sundays. His weathered face bore the deep lines of someone who had lived through genuine hardship, and his calloused hands rested peacefully in his lap, where Marcus radiated ambitious energy. Elijah carried profound stillness. The two had not spoken beyond polite nods. The house lights dimmed. The familiar theme music swelled. Cameras swept across the audience as applause erupted. Oprah stepped into the spotlight with practiced grace, her arms open in a gesture that seemed to embrace every viewer. "Hello, everybody," she called, her voice warm and commanding. "We have something special for you today." He's a legend who defined what it means to be tough on screen. He's directed masterpieces that changed cinema, and he's a man who rarely sits down for interviews anymore. Please welcome the incomparable Clint Eastwood. The applause intensified as a figure emerged from backstage. At 88 years old, Clint Eastwood moved with the deliberate care of advanced age. Yet there remained something unbreakable in his bearing. He stood tall, shoulders squared, each step measured and purposeful. He wore no designer suit or Hollywood polish, just a simple navy flannel shirt, well-worn jeans, and leather boots that had clearly seen many roads. His face, weathered by decades under sun and studio lights alike, carried the map of a life fully lived. But it was his eyes that held attention, steel gray, sharp as ever, missing nothing. He shook Oprah's hand with a firm grip, nodded once to the audience with a small wave, and took his seat. No performance, no showmanship, just presence. "It's been a long time since we've seen you on a talk show," Oprah began, settling into the rhythm she knew so well. "I think the last time was 7 or 8 years ago, something like that." Clint's voice was exactly as it had always been. Low, gravelly. Each word emerging with the economy of someone who had learned that silence often spoke louder than sound. Well, the cameras certainly missed you. So do the fans. What made you decide to come back to television now? Clint considered the question with characteristic seriousness. The studio waited. Felt like the right time. He said simply, "You get to a certain age. You realize the stories that matter aren't the ones in front of the camera." Oprah leaned forward slightly, her interviewer's instinct tingling. This was already different from the prepared talking points. "Let's talk about those stories then. 60 years in Hollywood. Dirty Harry. Unforgiven. $1 Million Baby. You didn't just act in westerns. You became one. When you look back at all those roles, which one feels most like you? Not Clint Eastwood the star, but the man?" The question hung in the air. Clint's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Walt Kowalski," he said after a moment. "The character from Gran Torino." Oprah clarified. "The angry Korean War veteran who doesn't trust anyone. The man who found redemption." Clint corrected quietly. The distinction was subtle but significant. Oprah caught it. "Redemption is an interesting word choice. That film ended with your character sacrificing himself. Was that about redemption or justice?" "Both," Clint said. "Can't have one without the other." In the third row, Marcus glanced up from his phone, momentarily caught by the unexpected depth of the exchange. Beside him, Pastor Elijah leaned forward, his attention sharpening. Richard's voice crackled in Oprah's earpiece. "Good. But transition to lighter stories. Entertainment. Not philosophy." Oprah reached up to adjust her earring, discreetly lowering the volume. Something was happening here. Something she didn't want to interrupt. "Clint, in 60 years of making films, of being one of the most recognized faces in the world, what would you say was the turning point? The moment that defined not your career, but your life?" It was the kind of question that could go many directions. Safe enough for television, but open enough for truth. Clint was quiet for a long moment. The cameras captured his face in close-up, the deep lines, the weathered skin, the eyes that had seen more than most could imagine. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Not louder, but heavier, carrying the weight of memory. "People think the defining moments are the victories," he said slowly. "The awards, the box office numbers, the standing ovations." He paused, and the studio held its breath. "But for me, it was a failure. A moment when everything I thought I controlled was taken away." The audience's energy shifted. This wasn't the expected Hollywood anecdote. This was something rawer. "What happened?" Oprah asked softly. Abandoning all pretense of following a script, Clint looked directly at her. And in that gaze was a vulnerability that seemed almost shocking from a man who had built a career on stoic strength. 1971. I had just started making real money. Had a nice house in Carmel. The studios wanted to work with me. Everything was going the way it was supposed to go." He stopped, and the silence stretched uncomfortably long. "My daughter, Emily, she was 8 years old. We were driving up the Pacific Coast Highway one Sunday afternoon. Beautiful day, sun shining. No reason to think anything could go wrong. The studio had gone completely still. A truck crossed the center line, hit us head on. I walked away with bruises. Emily." He paused, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his famously impassive expression. "They gave her less than 5% chance of surviving the night. Several audience members gasped. This was not in any press release or biography. I sat in that hospital corridor. Clint said, his voice steady but quiet. 3 in the morning. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Doctors coming and going with their careful faces, not wanting to say what they were thinking. He looked down at his weathered hands. I'd played tough guys my whole career. Men who never backed down. Never showed fear. Never admitted they couldn't handle something. But sitting there, with my little girl fighting for every breath behind a door I couldn't open. His jaw tightened. I was completely powerless. And I knew it. Oprah's professional composure wavered. Tears stood in her eyes. This was the kind of truth that transcended entertainment. "What did you do?" she asked. Her voice barely above a whisper. "I did something I'd never done before," Clint said. "I prayed." The word hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. I didn't know how. Wasn't raised religious. Never saw the point of it. But sitting in that hallway, with nothing left to try. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I asked God to save her. Not because I deserved it, but because she did." Richard's voice exploded in Oprah's earpiece. "Cut him off. This is getting too religious." Oprah reached up and removed the earpiece entirely, placing it on the arm of her chair. In 15 years of working together, Richard had never seen her do it. "And then what happened?" Oprah asked, ignoring everything but the man in front of her. "I heard something," Clint said simply. A voice, clear as I'm hearing yours now. It said, "You're not alone." Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. Marcus had lowered his phone completely. Pastor Elijah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Just those 3 words. Clint continued. But sitting there in that empty corridor at 3 in the morning, they were everything. "And Emily?" Oprah asked, though she sensed she already knew the answer. A ghost of a smile touched Clint's lips. The first real warmth his face had shown. "She pulled through. Doctors called it miraculous. She's 55 now. Trauma surgeon in San Francisco. Saves lives every day." The audience erupted in applause, grateful for the happy ending. But Clint raised a hand gently, and the applause died away. "That's not the end of the story," he said. "That night in the hospital was when I found God. Or maybe, when he found me." The statement was delivered without drama, without evangelical fervor, without any attempt to soften it for modern sensibilities. Just a simple declaration of fact. The temperature in the studio seemed to change. What had been warm and comfortable suddenly felt charged with tension. The kind that comes when comfortable assumptions are challenged. Oprah recovered her professional poise. But something in her expression had shifted. "Faith," she repeated, her tone carefully neutral, but carrying a hint of skepticism. "That's certainly not something we hear about often from Hollywood icons." A few audience members chuckled, relieved by the slight return to familiar territory. "No," Clint agreed. "It's not. I have to say," Oprah continued, her smile warm but her eyes sharp. "It seems almost paradoxical. A man who made his career playing violent roles, who represented a certain kind of American masculinity that wasn't exactly spiritual." She let the observation hang, inviting him to defend himself. But Clint didn't defend. He simply looked at her with those steel gray eyes and said, "The roles I played aren't who I am. They're who I was paid to pretend to be. But surely they influenced you." Oprah pressed gently. "Playing Dirty Harry. The man with no name. These aren't exactly Sunday school teachers." "No." Clint acknowledged. But they're not me. Then who are you? It was the kind of question Oprah was famous for. Simple on the surface. Profound underneath. Clint didn't deflect. I'm a man who was lost and got found, he said quietly. Everything else is just noise. The answer landed differently than anyone expected. It wasn't preachy or performative. It was simply true, delivered with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything. Richard, watching from the control booth, made frantic slashing motions, signaling to cut to commercial. But Oprah's earpiece sat abandoned on her chair, and she showed no signs of stopping. Clint, she said, leaning forward. When you say you found God, or God found you, what exactly do you mean? Because faith means so many things to so many people these days. It's not complicated, Clint replied. I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe he died for our sins and rose again. I believe his word is truth. The statement was delivered without apology, without qualification, without any attempt to make it more palatable. Just plain, unvarnished conviction. A ripple of reaction moved through the audience. Some faces lit up with recognition and agreement. Others looked uncomfortable, crossing arms or exchanging glances. Marcus, in the third row, actually rolled his eyes, though something in his expression suggested the cynicism wasn't quite as secure as it had been. That's very direct, Oprah said, her professional smile still in place, but her tone carefully neutral. Very specific. Truth usually is, Clint replied. But surely, Oprah continued, warming to the challenge. You recognize that millions of people have different beliefs, different paths to what they call truth? Sure. And they're all equally valid? No. The word dropped like a stone into still water. No elaboration. No softening. Just no. Oprah blinked, momentarily thrown off her rhythm. In all her years of interviewing spiritual seekers and religious leaders, she had become accustomed to a certain kind of answer, inclusive, tolerant, affirming that all paths lead to the same destination. Clint Eastwood was offering none of that comforting pluralism. That's quite a statement, she said, an edge creeping into her tone. Some might call it intolerant. Some might. Clint agreed. Doesn't make it less true. But how can you be so certain? Oprah pressed. Genuinely curious now. In a world with so many perspectives, so many different experiences of the divine, how can you say one way is right and others are wrong? Clint took his time answering. And in that pause, the weight of the question settled over everyone watching. Truth isn't determined by popular vote, he said finally. Gravity works whether you believe in it or not. The sun rises in the east regardless of anyone's opinion. Some things just are. But gravity is science. Oprah countered. Faith is personal. Faith is personal. Clint agreed. Truth isn't. The exchange had taken on a different quality now, moving from interview to genuine philosophical engagement. The audience sensed it. The energy in the studio had shifted from entertainment to something more substantial. Oprah sat back slightly, reassessing. This was not going according to plan, but it was going somewhere real, and that quality was rarer than gold in modern television. Well, she said, attempting to lighten the mood, you certainly haven't lost your directness over the years. Never saw the point in wasting words, Clint replied, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. The moment broke some of the tension, and the audience laughed. But Oprah wasn't ready to let it go. Her journalistic instincts were fully engaged now. I want to come back to something you said. About that night in the hospital, you said you heard a voice. Do you mean that literally? Like an audible voice? Yes. How do you know it wasn't just stress, exhaustion, your mind trying to cope? Clint looked at her steadily. Because what I heard wasn't what I wanted to hear. It wasn't, everything will be fine, or she'll survive. It was just, you're not alone. In my darkest moment. That's what mattered. Not a promise of the outcome I wanted, but the presence of someone bigger than my fear. Pastor Elijah, in the audience, closed his eyes briefly and nodded. Marcus, beside him, had gone very still, his phone forgotten in his lap. And that experience changed everything for you? Oprah asked. It showed me everything, Clint corrected. I'd spent 40 years thinking I was the main character in my own story. That night, I realized I was wrong. There's a bigger story, a bigger author, and my job isn't to write it, just to trust it. Oprah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For one of the few times in her career, she found herself genuinely uncertain how to proceed. In the control booth, Richard had given up on signals entirely. He stood with his arms crossed, watching with a mixture of dread and reluctant admiration. His carefully planned show was in ruins. But the ratings indicators climbing on the screens beside him told a different story. Back on stage, Oprah made a decision. She could steer this back to safe ground, pivot to prepared questions about his latest film. Or she could lean into this rare moment of authenticity and see where it led. She chose truth over comfort. Clint, she said, her voice carrying new weight. I think we need to talk more about this faith of yours. Because what you're saying challenges a lot of what people believe today. Including me. Clint nodded slowly. Unsurprised. I figured it might. So let's get into it. Oprah said, settling deeper into her chair. Let's talk about absolute truth in a relative world. About certainty in uncertain times. About faith that claims to be the only way. She looked directly at him, and in that look was both challenge and genuine curiosity. Because I think that's what this is really about. Isn't it? Yes. Clint said simply. It is. The studio lights seemed to burn a little brighter. The cameras rolled silently on. And 300 people in the audience, along with millions watching at home, sensed they were about to witness something rarely seen on television, an honest conversation about what truly mattered. The studio seemed to hold its breath as Oprah and Clint regarded each other across the small space between their chairs. What had begun as a standard celebrity interview had crossed into territory that modern television rarely ventured. Genuine philosophical confrontation. Oprah leaned back slightly, reassessing her approach. She had interviewed world leaders and spiritual teachers, navigated controversial topics with grace for 3 decades. But Clint Eastwood wasn't offering the usual careful qualifications or diplomatic hedging. He was stating absolutes in an age that had forgotten how to hear them. Clint, she began, her voice still warm but carrying a new edge of intellectual challenge. You use the word truth very confidently. Very. Absolutely. But in today's world, that kind of certainty makes many people uncomfortable. I know, Clint replied simply. Doesn't that concern you? That your certainty might come across as... She paused, choosing her word carefully. Exclusive. In a diverse society, when we claim one path is right and others are wrong, we risk division. Clint nodded slowly, as if he'd heard this objection many times before. There's a difference between saying something is true and saying I'm better than someone who believes differently. But that distinction gets lost. Oprah pressed. When you say, Christianity is the only way, people hear judgment. Truth often feels that way. The brevity of his response hung in the air. No apology. No softening. Just acknowledgement. Oprah shifted tactics. Her interviewer's instinct, finding a new angle. Let me ask you this. You've made over 60 films in your career, many of them violent. Dirty Harry essentially wrote the book on vigilante justice. How does that square with faith? With following a teacher who said to turn the other cheek? A few heads nodded in the audience. It was a fair question, one that highlighted what seemed like an obvious contradiction. Clint took his time answering, his weathered face thoughtful. I never claimed my films were Sunday school lessons. They were stories about flawed men in difficult situations. But you made violence look heroic. Oprah countered gently. Did I? Clint's steel gray eyes sharpened. Watch Unforgiven again. Really watch it. William Money is a killer who tried to change. Got pulled back into violence. And it destroys him. That film isn't about glorifying killing. It's about the cost of it. He paused. And when he continued, his voice carried the weight of decades of reflection. Every bullet has a consequence. Every violent act leaves a scar. That's what I was trying to show. Not that violence is good, but that it's real. And real things have real costs. And Dirty Harry? Oprah asked. He's become an icon of rough justice. Harry Callahan wasn't a hero because he shot people, Clint said firmly. He was a hero because he stood up when others wouldn't. Because he chose to act when action was needed. The gun was just a tool. The courage was the point. He leaned forward slightly, intensity building in his quiet voice. Gran Torino was my answer to all of it. Walt Kowalski was everything I'd played before. Tough, violent, angry. And the film showed where that path leads. To loneliness, to bitterness. He paused. But it also showed redemption. Walt didn't kill anyone at the end. He sacrificed himself. That's the opposite of violence. That's Christ. The answer was unexpected, profound in its simplicity. Oprah found herself genuinely impressed despite her disagreement. That's thoughtful, she acknowledged. But it brings me to another question. You've spent 60 years in Hollywood, an industry not exactly known for traditional values. How did you navigate that world while holding on to these beliefs? By choosing, Clint said. Every day. But didn't that cost you? Of course. Oprah sensed a story. Tell me about that. Clint was quiet for a moment, seeming to decide whether to open this particular door. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of old memories. Early 80s. I was offered a role in a big studio picture. Major director. 7-figure paycheck. Which was real money back then. But the script had me playing a character that went against everything I believed in. Not just violent, but cruel. Meaningless cruelty. What did you do? I said no. Just like that? Just like that. Clint's expression held no regret. The studio head called me personally, told me I was making a career mistake, that this film would be huge, that I'd regret it. Did you? A ghost of a smile touched Clint's lips. Film came out. Bombed. Studio filed for bankruptcy 2 years later. Sometimes integrity is the best investment you can make. In the audience. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. The story hit too close to home. How many times had he compromised for the next funding round? The next valuation milestone? He pushed the thought away. But it lingered. Oprah absorbed Clint's answer, then moved to what she sensed was the heart of the matter. Her voice took on a new warmth, the tone she used when discussing spirituality. Clint, I respect your conviction, but in my career, I've interviewed Buddhist monks who radiate peace, Muslim scholars who embody compassion, Hindu gurus who understand suffering in profound ways. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. They're all seeking the same things: love, peace. Meaning, why can't we acknowledge that all these paths are equally valid, different roads climbing the same mountain? It was a beautiful sentiment, eloquently expressed. Some in the audience nodded agreement. Even those who had been moved by Clint's earlier testimony found this vision of universal spiritual seeking appealing. Clint looked at Oprah steadily. When he spoke, his voice held no anger, no condescension, just unwavering certainty. Because Jesus said otherwise. The simple statement landed with devastating clarity. No elaborate theology, no apologetics, just direct reference to the source of his conviction. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Clint paused. Those aren't my words. They're his. And either he was telling the truth, or he was lying. There's no middle ground. Oprah's professional smile tightened slightly. But surely you see how that sounds to modern ears? To say that billions of good people, living moral lives, are somehow lost simply because they believe differently? I'm not saying they're bad people, Clint replied carefully. I'm saying they're lost. There's a difference. The distinction did nothing to soften the offense. If anything, it made it worse. People shifted in their seats. Some crossed their arms, faces hardening. Oprah's voice carried a new edge. And you don't see that as incredibly arrogant? To claim that you have the answer and billions of others don't? Clint was quiet for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He turned the question back on her. Let me ask you something. Oprah, you just said all paths are equally valid. You're certain about that, aren't you? Oprah blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I believe in tolerance, in respect for different beliefs. That's not what I asked. Clint said gently but firmly. You're certain that there's no absolute truth, that all paths lead to the same place, aren't you? Oprah hesitated, suddenly aware she was walking into something. You just accused me of arrogance for being certain I'm right. Clint continued, his voice still quiet but carrying new weight. But aren't you equally certain that I'm wrong? Isn't that the same thing? The question landed like a stone dropping into still water. Oprah opened her mouth, then closed it. For perhaps the first time in the interview, she had no immediate response. In the third row, Marcus looked up from his phone, suddenly riveted. Pastor Elijah leaned forward, recognition dawning in his eyes. The difference, Clint said into the silence, isn't that I'm certain and you're not. It's what we're certain about. You're certain there's no absolute truth. I'm certain there is. We both have faith. Oprah, just in different things. Oprah recovered slowly. But something in her expression had shifted. She had been challenged at a level she hadn't expected. And the experience was both unsettling and strangely compelling. That's, she began, then stopped. That's an interesting point. It wasn't agreement, but it was acknowledgement. And in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted subtly. They were no longer interviewer and subject, but two people genuinely wrestling with fundamental questions about the nature of truth itself. In the control booth, Richard watched with a mixture of anxiety and fascination. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something more dangerous and more real. Oprah took a breath, visibly regrouping. When she spoke again, her voice carried both frustration and genuine confusion. All right, but even if I grant your point about certainty, you're still saying that good works don't matter, that someone can live a moral life, help others, make the world better, and still be lost. How is that fair? It's not fair, Clint said quietly. That's the point. Grace isn't fair. If it were fair, we'd all be lost. Fair means getting what we deserve. Grace means getting what we don't. But that doesn't make sense. The words burst from Oprah before she could stop them. Why would God create a system where belief matters more than behavior? Because the problem isn't what we do, Clint replied. It's who we are. We're broken, and we can't fix ourselves. No matter how many good things we do, you can spend your whole life helping people and still need forgiveness. Because the standard isn't being better than other people, it's being perfect before God. But nobody's perfect, Oprah protested. Exactly. That's why we need Jesus. The exchange had reached a new intensity. The audience felt it. Even the camera operators found themselves leaning in. Before Oprah could respond, a voice cut through the tension. This is ridiculous. Every head turned. Marcus Reynolds stood in the third row, his face flushed, his expensive suit suddenly looking like armor that no longer fit. Security started to move, but Oprah raised her hand. Let him speak. Marcus's voice carried across the studio, tight with anger. I've been sitting here listening to this medieval thinking, and I can't take it anymore. He looked at Clint. Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, you sound like you're from another century. We're living in 2018. Science has explained what used to be mysteries. We don't need ancient superstitions to find meaning. Clint looked at the younger man with an expression that held no anger, only a deep, quiet sadness. How's that working out for you? Son, the question, delivered so gently, seemed to hit Marcus harder than any argument could have. His confident posture wavered slightly. I'm doing fine, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. I built my company from nothing. No prayer, no God, just hard work and intelligence. That's impressive, Clint said, and he sounded like he meant it. But I didn't ask about your company. I asked about you. Marcus's jaw tightened. I just told you. I'm fine. Are you? The simple question hung in the air. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. His hand, holding his phone, trembled slightly. What kind of question is that? Marcus finally managed. Defensive now. An honest one, Clint replied. Success and fine aren't the same thing. I've met a lot of successful people who weren't fine at all. Marcus laughed, but it sounded hollow. You don't know anything about me. I know what I see, Clint said quietly. I see a young man with everything the world says should make him happy. And I see someone who came to a talk show in the middle of a workday, sitting in the third row, recording everything on his phone. Looking for something? Marcus's face went pale. I'm not looking for anything. Then why are you here? The question was delivered without accusation, without judgment, just simple inquiry. And it broke something in Marcus. Because Marcus's voice cracked. He swallowed hard. Because last night I stood on the roof of my building, 40 floors up, and I thought about jumping. The studio went completely silent. The confession hung in the air, raw and terrible. I have everything. Marcus continued, his voice shaking now. Penthouse, cars, company worth billions. And last night, at 3 in the morning, I stood up there thinking that jumping would be easier than one more day of this. Tears started rolling down his face. So no, Mr. Eastwood, I'm not fine. I'm not fine at all. He sat down abruptly, his expensive suit crumpling, his carefully constructed persona shattered. Beside him, Pastor Elijah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. This time, Marcus didn't push it away. The studio remained frozen, shocked by the rawness of the moment. Oprah's eyes glistened with tears. Even the cameramen had stopped moving, caught in the gravity of genuine human brokenness. Clint stood slowly, his movements careful with age, and stepped toward the edge of the stage. He looked at Marcus with profound compassion. Son, what you're feeling right now, that emptiness success can't fill, that's not a weakness. It's your soul telling you the truth. You can have everything the world offers and still have nothing that matters. Marcus looked up, tears streaming down his face. Then what do I do? You stop trying to fill it with things that were never meant to fit. Clint said simply. Money, achievement, recognition. They're not big enough for the space inside you. Only God is. Oprah watched this exchange with an expression that was hard to read. Something in Marcus's breakdown had affected her deeply, perhaps because she recognized, in his desperation, echoes of her own questions. She stood, drawing attention back to the stage. Her voice was quieter than before, more personal. Clint, before we go any further, I need to ask you something. She paused, choosing her words carefully. You speak with such certainty, such conviction. Do you ever doubt? Does faith ever feel uncertain for you? It was the kind of question that could humanize him or expose him. Clint took his time answering. Of course I doubt, he said, finally. Anyone who says they never doubt is either lying or hasn't thought deeply enough. Oprah looked surprised. But you seem so certain. Certainty and doubt aren't opposites, Clint replied. They're companions. Faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's choosing to trust despite it. He paused, his weathered face thoughtful. Every believer I know wrestles with doubt. Dark nights when prayer feels like talking to an empty room. Moments when the silence feels louder than any voice. But that's when faith matters most. Not when it's easy, but when it's hard. There was something profoundly human in the admission. It softened the edges of his earlier absolutes, revealed the man behind the conviction. So doubt makes faith stronger? Oprah asked, genuinely curious now. It makes it real, Clint said. Faith that's never tested isn't faith. It's just belief that hasn't met the world yet. Real faith gets beaten up, questions itself, walks through valleys, and comes out the other side still trusting. Oprah nodded slowly. Absorbing this. That's... She searched for words. That's more nuanced than I expected. Faith isn't simple. Clint agreed. But it is clear. There's a difference. The exchange had created a new atmosphere in the studio. Something gentler, more thoughtful than the earlier confrontations. But Oprah wasn't finished wrestling with the implications of what Clint was saying. Clint, she said, her voice dropping to something more personal, less performative. Let me ask you directly. You really believe that billions of people, good people, seeking people, are lost? That they need saving? Yes. All of them? All of them. Oprah's voice dropped even lower. Even me? The question hung in the charged air of the studio. Every camera focused tight. Every audience member leaned forward. This was no longer about abstract theology. This was personal. Clint looked directly into Oprah Winfrey's eyes. And when he spoke, his voice held both compassion and unwavering conviction. Especially you. The studio froze. It was one thing to make broad theological statements about humanity in general. It was another thing entirely to look at one of the most powerful, most beloved figures in American media and tell her, directly and personally, that she was lost. Oprah's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, hurt, anger, and something else. Something that looked almost like fear. Especially me, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper but caught clearly by the microphones. Why especially me? Because you have the largest platform in America, Clint said, his voice gentle but firm, and you're using it to point people in the wrong direction. You're teaching self-salvation when we need a savior. You're offering comfort when people need truth. You're telling people to find their own way when there's only one way that leads home. The words were delivered without malice, but they landed with devastating force. This was no longer a philosophical debate. This was a direct confrontation between two visions of spiritual reality, played out before millions of watching eyes. Oprah stood perfectly still, her professional composure barely holding. Around them, the studio seemed to pulse with tension. Marcus, still recovering from his own breakdown, watched with wide eyes. Pastor Elijah had closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer, and neither side was backing down. The studio remained frozen in the wake of Clint's words. Especially you. The statement hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Impossible to ignore. Impossible to unsay. Oprah stood perfectly still, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to name. The woman who had interviewed presidents and princes, who had built an empire on connection and empathy, had just been told, on live television before millions, that she was lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and tight, barely containing the storm beneath. Especially me, she repeated, not as a question now, but as something she was trying to process. You're standing on my stage, in my studio, telling me that everything I've built, everything I've worked for, is leading people in the wrong direction. Yes, Clint said simply. No backpedaling, no softening. Oprah's professional composure cracked further. Her voice rose, emotion flooding through despite decades of practice at controlling it. I have spent 30 years of my life helping people find meaning. I've built schools for children who had nothing. I've created opportunities for voices that were never heard. I've brought people together across every division you can imagine. She took a step toward him, and for the first time in the interview, anger flashed in her eyes. And you're telling me I'm leading them wrong? That I'm pointing them in the wrong direction? With respect. Yes, Clint said, his voice remaining calm, steady as stone. Good works are important, but they're not salvation. You're teaching people they can save themselves, and that's the one thing they can't do. How dare you? Oprah said, and there was real heat in her voice now. You sit there with your certainty, your absolute conviction, and judge what I've built. Do you have any idea how many lives have been changed? I'm not judging what you've built, Clint replied gently. I'm questioning where it points. There's a difference. No. There isn't! The words burst from Oprah with surprising force. You're saying my work doesn't matter. That helping people, loving people, empowering people to believe in themselves, that none of that counts for anything. It counts, Clint said firmly, just not for salvation. The distinction seemed to infuriate Oprah more than any denial could have. She turned away from him. pacing a few steps before turning back. The audience watched, transfixed. This was not television anymore. This was real conflict, real pain, playing out in real time. Let me tell you something about certainty, Clint. Oprah's voice had taken on a new edge, sharp and cutting. Do you know how many wars have been fought because people were absolutely certain they were right? How many people have been killed, tortured, oppressed by those who claim to have the one true way? She gestured broadly, encompassing history itself. The Crusades, the Inquisition, witch trials, slavery defended with Bible verses. All of it done by people who had your kind of certainty. Several members of the audience applauded. Others nodded vigorously. This was the argument that modern sensibilities found most compelling, that certainty itself was dangerous, that absolute truth claims led inevitably to violence and oppression. Clint waited for the applause to die down. When he spoke, his voice held no defensiveness, no anger, just that same unwavering calm. "You're right," he said. "All of those things happened. Evil men did evil things in God's name." Oprah looked surprised that he'd agreed so readily. "But," Clint continued, "that doesn't make God evil. It makes those men evil. They twisted truth to serve power. That's not faith. That's blasphemy. How convenient." Oprah shot back. "Every time someone points out the harm religion has done, you say those weren't real believers? You get to keep your faith pure by disowning anyone who makes it look bad." "No," Clint said, leaning forward slightly. "Real believers do harm too. We're all broken. We all fail. The difference is between people who submit to God and people who use God for their own purposes." He paused, his steel-gray eyes intense. Hitler didn't fail because he believed in absolute truth. He failed because he believed he was the absolute truth. He put himself in God's place. That's the opposite of real faith. "And how do we know you're not doing the same thing?" Oprah challenged. "How do we know your certainty isn't the same kind of dangerous arrogance?" "Because I'm not the standard," Clint replied quietly. "I'm just pointing to it. If I said, 'Believe me because I'm wise,' that would be arrogance. But I'm saying, 'Believe Jesus because he's true.' There's a difference." Oprah shook her head, frustration evident in every line of her body. "It still sounds like judgment." "Clint, it still sounds like you're saying billions of people are wrong and you're right. I'm saying billions of people are lost and Jesus is the way," Clint corrected. "Including me. I'm as lost as anyone without him." The clarification did little to ease the tension. If anything, it made things more difficult. Oprah couldn't attack him for arrogance when he kept deflecting to Christ. She couldn't accuse him of superiority when he kept insisting on his own need for grace. In the third row, Marcus sat with his head in his hands, Pastor Elijah's hand still resting gently on his shoulder. The older man had said nothing since Marcus's breakdown, but his presence was solid, steady, a quiet anchor in the storm. Oprah turned away from Clint again, struggling visibly to regain her equilibrium. When she turned back, her voice was quieter but no less intense. "All right, let me try to understand this. You're saying that truth is absolute, that there's one way and only one way, that everyone who doesn't believe exactly what you believe is lost?" "Not exactly what I believe," Clint said. "What Jesus taught." "Fine. What Jesus taught." Oprah waved her hand impatiently. "But here's what I don't understand. If God is love, as you claim, how is it loving to create a system where most of humanity is condemned, where being good isn't enough, where sincere seeking in other traditions leads nowhere. It was perhaps the most fundamental question, the one that had troubled thinkers for centuries. How to reconcile divine love with divine judgment. How to hold together grace and truth. Clint was quiet for a long moment. And in that silence, the weight of the question settled over the studio. Because love tells the truth, he said finally. Even when it hurts. Oprah looked at him sharply. Explain that. If I saw you walking toward a cliff in fog, and I stayed silent because I didn't want to seem judgmental, would that be love? We've been through this already, Oprah said impatiently. But it only works if the cliff is real. You're assuming danger that I don't believe exists. And that's the real question. Isn't it? Clint said. Not whether I'm arrogant for warning you, but whether the danger is real. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a new urgency. Oprah, I'm not standing here judging you because I think I'm better. I'm pleading with you because I know I'm not. I needed saving. I still need it every day. And if Jesus is who he claimed to be, if he really did die and rise again, if heaven and hell are real, then the most unloving thing I could do is stay silent. There was something in his voice that broke through Oprah's anger. Not agreement, but recognition of genuine concern. Whatever else she thought of his theology, she couldn't doubt his sincerity. So you really believe it, she said quietly. You really believe I'm going to hell if I don't accept Jesus? Clint's weathered face showed deep sadness. I believe you're separated from God, and that separation, extended into eternity, is what hell is. And all the good I've done means nothing? It means everything to the people you've helped, Clint said gently. But it doesn't change your standing before God. You can feed every hungry person on earth and still need forgiveness. Because the problem isn't that we don't do enough good. It's that we're fundamentally broken. And we can't fix that ourselves. Oprah felt tears threatening and fought them back. This conversation was cutting deeper than she'd expected. Touching places she rarely let anyone see. What you're describing sounds like a God who sets impossible standards and then punishes people for not meeting them. No, Clint said. It's a God who sets a perfect standard and then meets it himself. That's what the cross was. God taking the punishment we deserved. Not asking us to be good enough, but being good enough for us. But only if we believe the right things. Oprah pressed. Only if we accept the gift. Clint corrected. If someone offers you $1 million and you refuse it, it's not their fault. You stay poor. The analogy was simple. Perhaps too simple for the complexity of the theological questions at stake, but it cut through some of the confusion. Oprah stood silently for a moment, and the studio held its breath. Then she asked the question that had been building throughout the conversation. Clint, do you think I'm a bad person? No, he said immediately and emphatically. I think you're a person, good and bad, like all of us, capable of great kindness and great blindness, made in God's image and broken by sin. Then why isn't that enough? Her voice cracked slightly on the question. Why isn't trying to be good, trying to help people, trying to make the world better? Why isn't that enough? Because enough isn't the standard, Clint said softly. Perfect is, and none of us can reach it. That's why we need Jesus. Not to make us good enough, to forgive us for not being. The theological explanation was clear. Orthodox, traditional, and to Oprah, it felt both compelling and impossible. Everything in her modern, progressive worldview rebelled against the idea that human goodness wasn't sufficient. Everything in her success-oriented culture insisted that effort and intention mattered most. But standing there, confronted by Clint's gentle certainty, she felt something shifting inside her. Not conversion, not agreement, but the first crack in a foundation she'd thought was solid. "I don't," she began, then stopped, started again. "I don't know how to respond to what you're saying." It was perhaps the most honest thing she'd said all interview. The admission of uncertainty from someone who had built a career on having answers. "You don't have to respond," Clint said gently. "Just consider it." In the audience, Pastor Elijah slowly stood. Security moved reflexively. But Oprah waved them off. She recognized in the old man's face something similar to what she saw in Clint's. Not judgment, but compassion. "Ms. Winfrey," Elijah said, his voice carrying clearly through the studio despite its gentleness. "May I say something?" Oprah nodded, grateful perhaps for any interruption to the intensity of her exchange with Clint. Elijah stepped carefully into the aisle. He was 70 years old. His simple brown suit worn but clean. His face lined with the kind of scars that come from living honestly. "I don't know you, ma'am. Never met you before today. But I know something about what Mr. Eastwood is saying." He paused, choosing his words carefully. 35 years ago, I killed a man, drunk driving. Took a father from his children, a husband from his wife. The studio went quiet. This was not what anyone had expected. I went to prison. 10 years. And I deserved every day of it. Eliah's voice remained steady, but his eyes held old pain. In that cell, I had plenty of time to think about goodness, about whether I was a good person or a bad person. And I realized that wasn't the right question. He looked directly at Oprah. The question was, could a guilty man be forgiven? Could someone who destroyed a family be made clean? Could mercy reach even me? Tears stood in his eyes now. In that prison, I found the answer. Not because I earned it. Not because I became good enough. But because Jesus died for guilty people. For the worst of us. He gestured to Marcus, still sitting with his head in his hands. "This young man here, he's hurting. Not because he's bad. Because he's human. Because success and money and achievement, they're not big enough to fill the space inside us. Only God is." Elijah turned back to Oprah. "You've done great things, ma'am. More than I ever could. But Mr. Eastwood isn't saying they don't matter. He's saying they can't save. And there's a difference." The old pastor's testimony landed differently than Clint's had. Perhaps because he spoke from such evident brokenness, such clear knowledge of his own need. There was no possible way to accuse him of superiority or arrogance. Oprah stood silent, absorbing his words. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She sat down, not in her interview chair, but on the edge of the stage, as if her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "I don't know what to do with this," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Clint remained in his chair, watching her with compassion. "You don't have to do anything right now, except be honest about where you are." "Where I am," Oprah repeated. She looked up at him, and in her eyes was a vulnerability rarely seen by anyone. "Where I am is confused. Where I am is shaken. Where I am is—" She paused, searching for the word. "Uncertain. That's a beginning," Clint said gently. "A beginning of what?" "Of real seeking. Not seeking what makes you comfortable. Seeking what's true." Oprah wrapped her arms around herself. a gesture of self-protection that seemed almost childlike, coming from such a powerful figure. You're asking me to consider that everything I've built my life on might be wrong. I'm asking you to consider that it might be incomplete, Clint said. You've spent your life pointing people to their own power, their own potential. And there's truth in that. We are capable of amazing things, but we're also fundamentally broken. And we can't fix that ourselves, no matter how hard we try. So all my work helping people believe in themselves helps them be more confident, broken people, Clint finished. Which is good, but it doesn't heal the brokenness. The assessment was harsh in its clarity, but delivered without cruelty. Just a statement of what Clint believed to be true. Oprah sat in silence for a long moment. The cameras continued rolling. The audience barely breathed. This was no longer entertainment. This was a human soul wrestling with eternal questions. And everyone could sense the weight of it. Finally, Oprah spoke. Her voice barely above a whisper. I don't have answers, Clint. For the first time in 30 years of broadcasting, I'm sitting here and I don't have answers. That's the most honest thing you've said tonight, Clint replied. But if I don't have answers, what do I tell people? What do I tell the millions who look to me for guidance? Tell them the truth. That you're seeking. That you don't know. That certainty comes from surrender. Not from figuring everything out. Oprah looked at him with something between desperation and hope. And you think that's enough? Just not knowing? It's enough to start, Clint said. God doesn't need you to have all the answers. He needs you to have an honest heart. In the control booth, Richard had long since given up trying to manage the show. Network executives were on the phone, but he wasn't listening. He was watching something unprecedented, Oprah Winfrey, stripped of her usual confidence, wrestling with questions that mattered more than ratings or demographics. On stage, Oprah stood slowly. She looked at Clint, then at Pastor Elijah, then out at the audience. Her eyes found Marcus, still sitting with his head in his hands, broken and honest in his brokenness. I need, she began, then stopped. I need time to think about this. Take all the time you need, Clint said. But don't take forever. None of us know how much time we have. The statement wasn't a threat, just a fact. One delivered with the gravitas of someone who understood mortality intimately. Oprah nodded slowly. Then she turned to the camera, and when she spoke, her voice carried a new quality. Not the polished certainty of a media professional, but the hesitant honesty of someone stepping into unknown territory. We're going to take a break, she said. When we come back, she paused, unsure what to promise. When we come back, we'll continue this conversation, because I think it's one we all need to have. The red light on the camera blinked off, but no one moved. The studio remained suspended in the gravity of what had just transpired. A confrontation that had pushed beyond politeness into genuine struggle. A challenge that had shaken foundations and left nothing resolved, but everything exposed. And in that exposure, in that moment of admitted uncertainty, something shifted. Not conversion, not transformation, but the first crack in armor that had seemed impenetrable, the first admission that the questions were bigger than the answers she'd been giving. Clint sat quietly in his chair, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed, his lips moved in silent prayer. For Oprah, for Marcus, for everyone watching who might be wrestling with the same questions. For truth to break through the comfortable lies that culture told. And in the third row, Marcus slowly lifted his head. His face was wet with tears, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been in years. Pastor Elijah's hand remained on his shoulder, steady and sure. The break wouldn't last long. The conversation would continue. But in this moment, in this pause, something essential had happened. Not resolution, but recognition. Not answers, but honest questions. Not the end of the story, but perhaps, for some, the beginning of a different one. The studio lights dimmed slightly during what should have been a commercial break, but the cameras never stopped rolling. Network executives had made the call: keep broadcasting. Whatever was happening here was too significant to interrupt. Oprah had walked off stage, her footsteps echoing in the unusual silence. The audience remained seated, whispering among themselves in hushed tones. On stage, Clint sat exactly as he had been, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed in what could only be prayer. Backstage, in her dressing room, Oprah stood before the mirror. Her makeup artist approached with powder, but Oprah waved her away. She stared at her reflection, seeing not the carefully constructed image that appeared on magazine covers, but something rawer. Tears stood in her eyes, threatening to fall. The door burst open. Richard Sterling entered without knocking, his face flushed, his clipboard forgotten somewhere behind him. Ms. Winfrey, the network is calling every 30 seconds. The ratings are through the roof. Social media is exploding. But we need to know what you want to do. Do we continue? Do we end this? Oprah didn't turn from the mirror. What do you think I should do? Richard? I think. He paused, clearly torn between professional calculation and genuine concern. I think this is the most dangerous moment of your career. And maybe the most important. Dangerous how? You're questioning everything you've built. On live television. In front of millions. If you keep going down this path. He trailed off. If I keep going down this path. What? Oprah turned to face him now, and he was startled by the vulnerability in her eyes. I might lose my empire? My influence? Yes, Richard said bluntly. And if I don't go down this path? If I play it safe and wrap this up with some platitudes about respecting different beliefs? Richard had no answer. Oprah looked back at the mirror one more time. I've spent 30 years telling people to be authentic, to live their truth. Maybe it's time I did the same. Oprah, you can't. Watch me. She moved toward the door, her burgundy dress swishing with each step. And Richard? No more earpiece. No more script. Whatever happens out there happens. She walked back toward the stage, and Richard stood alone in the dressing room, watching his carefully planned show disintegrate into something he couldn't control. When Oprah returned to the stage, the audience began to applaud politely, but she raised her hand, stopping them. Please, no applause. This isn't a performance anymore. Her voice carried a new quality, stripped of its usual polish. If it ever was. She sat down, not in her usual position of control, but closer to Clint, as if proximity might help her understand what she was wrestling with. Her eyes were slightly red, her makeup unrefreshed. She had never looked more human on camera. Clint, she said quietly, I need to ask you something real. Not for the show, not for the audience. For me. Clint opened his eyes, looking at her with that same steady compassion that had characterized everything he'd said. Go ahead. Oprah took a shaky breath. I've spent my entire adult life building this. She gestured around the studio, but the gesture encompassed more than the physical space. An empire. Influence. A platform to help people. I genuinely believed I was doing good. that I was making a difference. Her voice cracked slightly. But if you're right, if what you're saying is true, then I've wasted my life. Worse than wasted it. I've led millions of people in the wrong direction. Tears began rolling down her face, and she didn't try to stop them. Tell me honestly, Clint, have I wasted my life? The question hung in the air, raw and desperate. The audience sat frozen. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. Clint leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. No, Oprah, you haven't wasted it. She looked up, surprise, flickering through the tears. God uses everything. Clint continued. Even our mistakes, even our misdirection. He's big enough to work through our brokenness. He paused. But recognition is the first step. You can't fix what you won't admit is broken. Oprah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so uncharacteristic of her polished public persona that it shocked those watching. I've helped people believe in themselves. I've empowered them to find their own strength. Isn't that good? It's good, Clint acknowledged. But it's not enough. Because the problem isn't that people don't believe in themselves. The problem is that they believe the wrong thing can save them. They believe their own strength is sufficient. And it's not. Oprah started to respond, then stopped. She was silent for a long moment. And in that silence, something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance, but the beginnings of genuine consideration. Clint, she said finally, you speak with such certainty about all of this. But how do you know? How can you be so sure? Clint was quiet, his weathered face thoughtful. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old memory. Painful but precious. Can I tell you a story I've never told publicly before? Oprah nodded. 1975. I had a production company. We were making a film about redemption, about a man trying to outrun his past. I poured everything into it. Every dollar I had. All my time. My reputation. He paused, his eyes distant. Then the lead actor quit 2 weeks before shooting. The studio pulled funding. The whole project collapsed. He looked down at his weathered hands. I lost everything. Had to sell my ranch in Carmel. Moved into a small cabin in Big Sur. 1 room. No running water. As far from Hollywood as I could get without leaving the state. The studio was completely silent. This was not the story anyone expected from Clint Eastwood. One night, sitting in that cabin, completely alone, I looked at the gun I kept on the shelf, a Winchester. I took it down, loaded it, sat there with it in my hands, thinking that maybe ending it would be easier than facing one more day of failure. Someone in the audience gasped. Oprah's hand went to her mouth. I had the barrel under my chin. Clint continued, his voice steady but heavy, finger on the trigger, and I heard a voice, clear as I'm speaking to you now. It said, "Put it down. You're not finished yet." He looked up at Oprah, and in his eyes was the memory of that moment, still vivid after more than 40 years. I didn't believe in God then. Thought religion was for weak people who couldn't face reality. But sitting there in that cabin, alone and broken, I didn't have anywhere else to turn, so I put the gun down. And I prayed. First time in my life I really prayed. What did you say? Oprah asked softly. I said, God, if you're real, I need you to prove it. Because I can't do this anymore. I can't fix this. I can't fix me. Clint's voice was quiet but intense. And Oprah, peace came. Not success. Not answers to all my questions. Not even hope that things would get better. Just peace. In the middle of the chaos, there was peace. He leaned forward. That's how I know. Not because I figured it out intellectually. Not because I was raised that way. But because I was broken enough to need God. And he met me in that brokenness. Oprah sat perfectly still, absorbing his words. Before she could respond, movement caught her eye. Pastor Elijah was standing in the audience. Yes, Oprah said, gesturing for him to speak. Elijah moved slowly down the aisle, his age evident in his careful steps, but his dignity unmistakable. When he reached the stage, he looked at both Oprah and Clint. Mr. Eastwood, Ms. Winfrey, forgive me for interrupting, but Mr. Eastwood's story, it reminded me of my own. Oprah nodded for him to continue. I'm Pastor Elijah Green, 70 years old. 35 years ago, I killed a man in a drunk driving accident, took a father from his 3 children, a husband from his wife. The audience drew a collective breath. I went to prison, 10 years. And every day of those 10 years, I knew I deserved to be there. His voice remained steady, but his eyes held decades of pain. In that cell, another inmate gave me a Bible. I laughed at him, told him God wouldn't want anything to do with someone like me. He paused. And when he continued, his voice was thick with emotion. But one night, I had nothing else to do. So I opened it. Found Romans 5. Verse 8. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Tears rolled down the old man's lined face. While we were still sinners, not after we cleaned ourselves up, not after we proved we were good enough, while we were still broken and guilty and lost, that's when Christ died for us. He turned to Marcus, still sitting in the 3rd row with tear-stained cheeks. Young man, I see your pain. I don't know your story, but I know what it's like to have everything feel empty, to wonder if it's worth continuing. Marcus looked up, his expensive suit rumpled, his carefully constructed image shattered. You think success will fill the void, Elijah said gently. But it won't. I tried everything for 70 years before I found what actually fits in that space. And it's not achievement. It's not recognition. It's knowing you're loved not because of what you've done, but despite what you've done. The words hung in the air, simple and profound. Oprah stood slowly. She looked at Clint, then at Elijah, then out at the audience. When she spoke, her voice trembled. I've spent 30 years of my career giving people answers, telling them they have the power within themselves, that they can find their own truth, that believing in yourself is enough. She paused, wiping tears from her face. But tonight, standing here, I have to admit something. The studio held its breath. I don't have answers, Oprah said, her voice breaking. I've built an empire on having answers. And right now, I don't have them. I don't know if what you're saying is true. I don't know if I can believe it. But I know. She stopped, struggling to find words. I know that what I've been teaching isn't enough. Because I see the peace in your eyes, Clint. In yours, Elijah. And I don't have that peace. It was perhaps the most vulnerable moment of her public life. The admission that everything she'd built might be incomplete, that the questions were bigger than her answers. Clint stood slowly and crossed the small distance between them. He didn't embrace her, didn't make a show of comfort. He simply extended his hand. That's enough for now, he said quietly. God doesn't need perfect faith. He needs an honest heart. You don't have to have all the answers today, You just have to admit you don't have them. Oprah looked at his extended hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she took it, not as a gesture of conversion, but as an acknowledgement of connection, of genuine seeking meeting, genuine conviction. I don't, she whispered. I really don't. The audience's reaction was mixed. Some stood, moved by the raw honesty of the moment. Others sat with arms crossed, uncomfortable with where the conversation had led. Some wept openly. Others looked troubled, wrestling with their own questions. Marcus stood in the third row, watching this exchange. Then, as if pulled by something he couldn't resist, he began moving toward the stage. Security moved to intercept, but Oprah waved them off. Marcus climbed the stairs slowly, his movements uncertain. He stood before Clint and Oprah, this 34-year-old tech genius worth billions, and he looked like a lost child. I don't know what to do, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Last night, I stood on that roof, and I wanted to jump. Today, I'm here, and I don't know why. I don't know what I'm looking for. I don't even know if what you're saying is true, but I know. His voice broke. I know I can't keep living the way I have been. Clint looked at the younger man with profound compassion. Then don't. What do I do instead? You stop running, Clint said simply. You stop trying to fill the emptiness with things that were never meant to fit. And you ask the only one who can actually fill it to come in. Just like that? Marcus's voice carried both hope and skepticism. Just like that, Clint confirmed. It's not complicated. We make it complicated. But it's not. You're broken. You need healing. You can't heal yourself. So you ask the healer. Pastor Elijah stepped forward, placing his hand on Marcus's shoulder. Would you like to pray? Son? Marcus looked at Oprah, as if seeking permission or understanding. She nodded slowly, tears still streaming down her face. I don't know how, Marcus admitted. Neither did I. Elijah said. Neither did Mr. Eastwood. Neither does anyone. The first time. You just talk. Honestly. The studio watched in complete silence as three men stood on the stage, an aging film legend who had found faith in a cabin 40 years ago, an old pastor who had found it in a prison cell, and a young entrepreneur who was finding it. Perhaps, in this moment, Marcus closed his eyes. His lips moved, but no one could hear what he said. Perhaps it was just a wordless cry. Perhaps it was the beginning of conversation with someone he'd never believed existed. Whatever it was real. And in that reality, in that moment of three broken people acknowledging their brokenness, something shifted in the studio. Not for everyone, not even for most, but for some watching, either in the audience or at home. A question awakened. A consideration began. A possibility emerged. Oprah stood apart, watching. She had not prayed. She had not made any declaration of faith. But she had admitted uncertainty. And in that admission, she had taken the first step towards something she couldn't yet name. The cameras continued rolling. And the story, far from over, moved toward its conclusion. Marcus stood on the stage, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. The words were simple, perhaps clumsy, but they were real. And in that reality, something profound was happening. When he opened his eyes, they were red with tears, but somehow clearer than they'd been in years. He looked at Clint, then at Pastor Elijah, then at Oprah. I don't feel different, he said. almost apologetically. I thought. I don't know what I thought. You don't have to feel different, Clint said quietly. Faith isn't about feelings. It's about trust. The feelings come and go. The trust remains. Marcus nodded slowly, processing. Then, he looked at Elijah. What happens now? The old pastor smiled gently. Now you learn to walk, like a child learning to use legs that have always been there but never been trusted. You'll stumble. You'll fall. But you're not alone anymore. In the audience, people were reacting in vastly different ways. Some sat with tears streaming down their faces, moved by what they'd witnessed. Others looked uncomfortable, even angry, as if they'd been tricked into watching something they hadn't signed up for. Several had already left, walking out in protest of the turn the show had taken. But most remained, caught in the gravity of what was unfolding. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something raw, more consequential, and they couldn't look away. Oprah stood apart from the three men, her arms wrapped around herself. She had not prayed. She had not made any declaration. But her mascara was smeared, her composure shattered, her carefully constructed image lying in pieces around her expensive shoes. Before anyone could speak, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from backstage. Richard Sterling burst onto the set, his face flushed red with fury. His clipboard finally abandoned somewhere behind him. Enough! His voice cracked across the studio like a whip. This ends now. Every head turned. Security moved toward him. But he waved them off with an authority he still thought he possessed. Ms. Winfrey, I need to speak with you. Immediately. Off camera. Oprah looked at him, and in her eyes was something he'd never seen before. Not the collaborative partner he'd worked with for 15 years. Something harder. Something that had made a decision. No. Richard, whatever you have to say it here. Richard's face went even redder. You can't be serious. We need to discuss this privately. We don't. Oprah said simply. Say what you came to say. Richard glanced at the cameras, clearly uncomfortable with the public confrontation. But his anger overrode his caution. Fine. You've just destroyed everything we built. 30 years of careful brand management. Gone in 2 hours. You've alienated half our audience. You've made the show about religion, which violates every principle of inclusive programming we've ever stood for. He pointed at Clint. This man comes on our show and tells millions of viewers that they're lost, that their beliefs are wrong, that there's only one way. And instead of challenging that intolerance, you're standing here crying, acting like he's revealed some profound truth. Oprah listened without interrupting, her face calm despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. The network is calling every 30 seconds. Richard continued, his voice rising. Advertisers are threatening to pull out. Your team is in chaos. And for what? For some outdated theology that belongs in the Dark Ages? He took a step closer to her. Oprah, you're better than this. We're better than this. This isn't who we are. We empower people. We celebrate diversity. We don't tell them they're wrong for believing what they believe. When Richard finally stopped, breathing hard from his outburst, the studio was silent. All eyes were on Oprah, waiting to see how she would respond. She took a slow breath. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. You're right about one thing. Richard, this isn't who we've been, but maybe. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Maybe who we've been isn't enough. Richard stared at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. What are you saying? I'm saying that for 30 years. I've told people what they wanted to hear, that they have the power within themselves, that all paths lead to the same place, that being good is enough. Her voice grew stronger. But tonight, I met 3 people who challenged everything I believe, and instead of having answers, I have questions. Real questions. For the first time in a long time. So, you're throwing away your entire philosophy because an actor and a preacher made you feel something? Richard's voice dripped with disdain. No, Oprah said firmly. I'm admitting I don't have all the answers. That maybe the questions are bigger than the comfortable platitudes I've been offering. Richard's expression hardened. If you continue down this path, you'll lose everything. The show, the network, your influence, everything. Then I'll lose it, Oprah said, and there was steel in her voice now. Because I'm done building an empire on things I'm not sure I believe anymore. The words hung in the air, shocking in their finality. You can't mean that, Richard said, but his voice had lost its certainty. I do. Oprah looked at him with something like pity. Richard, you've been a good producer. You've helped build something remarkable. But you've also taught me to value the wrong things, to chase ratings over truth, to avoid difficult questions because they make people uncomfortable. She stepped toward him. You're fired. The studio gasped. Richard's face went white, then red again. You can't fire me. I have a contract. You're right. I can't fire you as producer, but I can fire you as someone I listen to, as someone whose values guide this show. She turned to the cameras, addressing them directly now. And if the network doesn't like that, they can cancel the show. I'm done compromising truth for comfort. Richard stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. The woman he'd worked with for 15 years, the carefully managed brand he'd helped create, was dismantling it all in real time. You'll regret this, he said finally, his voice tight. Maybe, Oprah acknowledged, but I'll regret staying silent more. Richard looked around the studio, perhaps hoping for support, for someone to tell Oprah she was making a mistake. But he found only faces watching with a mixture of shock and admiration. Even the crew members who had worked with him for years looked at Oprah with new respect. He turned and walked off the stage, his footsteps echoing in the silence. And with his departure, something shifted in the atmosphere. A weight lifted. A pretense dropped. Oprah turned back to the others on stage. Clint remained seated, watching with that same steady compassion. Pastor Elijah had his hand on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus himself looked dazed, as if he'd stumbled into a moment far bigger than himself. I don't know what I believe, Oprah said, addressing them and the audience and the millions watching at home. I can't stand here and tell you I'm suddenly convinced of everything Clint has said. That would be dishonest. She wiped her face, not caring about the smeared makeup or the tears. But I can tell you this. For 30 years, I've told people to find their own truth, to trust themselves, to believe they have the power to save themselves. And tonight, I met people who have something I don't. Peace, certainty, purpose that goes beyond success or recognition. Her voice grew stronger. So I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to admit I don't know. I'm going to seek honestly, even if it means losing everything I've built. Because maybe everything I've built was built on the wrong foundation. The audience's reaction was immediate and divided. Some stood, applauding with tears in their eyes. Others sat with arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable with the direction she'd taken. Several more stood and walked out, unwilling to remain for what felt like a betrayal of the values the show had always represented. But Oprah stood firm, watching them go without trying to stop them. Clint rose slowly from his chair and approached her. He didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes or promises. He simply placed a weathered hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and respect. "The hard part isn't admitting you don't know," he said quietly. "The hard part is what comes after. When the questions get harder and the answers don't come as quickly as you want, when doubt creeps in and the old ways of thinking try to reclaim their territory." "How do you keep going?" Oprah asked. "You remember the moment you knew something was missing," Clint said. "You remember that. Nothing else filled that space. And you trust that the one who made the space knows what belongs in it." Pastor Elijah stepped forward, his old face gentle with understanding. "Ms. Winfrey, might I pray for you?" Oprah hesitated, then nodded. Elijah didn't make a show of it. No dramatic gestures or eloquent phrases. Just simple words spoken with profound sincerity. "Father, this woman has spent her life trying to help others. She's done much good. But now she stands at a crossroads, uncertain and seeking. Give her courage to continue seeking. Give her wisdom to recognize truth when she finds it. And give her peace in the uncertainty." He paused, then added, "And Lord, if she's willing, meet her where she is, not where she thinks she should be, where she actually is." "Amen. Amen," Clint said quietly. Marcus whispered it too. "Amen." Oprah stood silently, but something in her expression suggested the prayer had touched something deep. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment. In the control booth, Lisa, Richard's assistant, sat alone at the panel. She watched the monitors with tears streaming down her face. This wasn't what they'd planned. This wasn't what anyone had planned. But it was real, and that made it more valuable than anything they could have scripted. On stage, the four people stood together, an aging film legend who had found faith in a cabin 40 years ago, an old pastor who had found it in a prison cell, a young entrepreneur who had found it moments before, and a media icon who was just beginning to seek it. They stood in silence, and the silence was more powerful than any words could have been. Gradually, the audience grew quiet too. Even those who disagreed, even those who were angry or confused, felt the weight of the moment. This was not triumphalism. This was not a declaration of victory. This was simply honesty. Four broken people acknowledging their brokenness and reaching towards something bigger than themselves. Oprah finally turned to face the camera directly. Her eyes were red, her makeup ruined, her carefully constructed image completely abandoned. And somehow, she had never looked more beautiful. "I don't know where this goes," she said to the viewers at home. "I don't know if I'll believe what Clint believes. I don't know if I can accept what Pastor Elijah has found. But I know that the certainty I've been selling, the self-salvation I've been preaching, isn't enough. Because if it were, I'd have the peace these men have. And I don't." She took a breath. "So I'm going to seek, really seek, not for what makes me comfortable, but for what's true. And I invite you to do the same. Not to follow me, not to accept what I say, but to ask the hard questions, to admit when you don't have answers, to stop pretending that being good is the same as being whole." She looked at Clint one more time. "Thank you for not letting me stay comfortable." Clint nodded, his weathered face holding both sadness and hope. "Comfort isn't what we need. Truth is." The red light on the camera blinked off, but no one moved. The studio remained suspended in that moment, in the gravity of what had just occurred. Slowly, people began to stand, not in applause, but in acknowledgement. Some headed for the exits, shaking their heads. Others remained seated, clearly wrestling with their own questions. A few approached the stage, drawn by something they couldn't articulate but couldn't ignore. Marcus sat down on the edge of the stage, exhausted by the emotional weight of the past hours. Pastor Elijah sat beside him. The two men silent but connected by their shared brokenness and their tentative steps toward healing. Clint walked slowly back to his chair and sat down. His eyes closed in what could only be prayer. For Oprah, for Marcus, for everyone who had watched and wrestled with the questions raised, for truth to continue its work, and Oprah stood alone at center stage, looking out at the emptying studio, at the cameras that were finally powering down, at the empire that might be crumbling. And she smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. Because for the first time in 30 years, she wasn't performing. She was just being. And that, somehow, was enough. 3 weeks later, the footage aired without edits. The network had initially wanted to bury it, to pretend the confrontation had never happened. But the clip had already leaked online, spreading across social media faster than anyone could control. Within 48 hours, it was the most watched video in the world. The response was immediate and divided. Some celebrated Oprah's honesty. Others accused her of betraying her principles. Religious leaders debated the theology. Critics analyzed the cultural implications. But everyone agreed. Something significant had happened. Oprah took a sabbatical, stepping away from the show for the first time in 3 decades. She didn't announce a conversion. She didn't make declarations of faith. She simply said she was seeking, honestly and without pretense. Marcus Reynolds resigned as CEO of his company. His board was shocked. His investors were furious. But he didn't care. He started volunteering at a homeless shelter, working with young men who reminded him of the person he'd been days before his breakdown. Pastor Elijah's small church grew rapidly, not because he advertised or marketed, but because people who had seen the broadcast came seeking what he had found. Within months, attendance had tripled, the humble building overflowing every Sunday with seekers and skeptics alike. And Clint Eastwood returned to his ranch, declining every interview request, every invitation to capitalize on the moment. He had said what needed saying. The rest was between God and those who heard. The conversation had ended, but the questions remained. And for millions who watched, those questions were only beginning. In the weeks following the broadcast, viewer response was unprecedented. The Oprah Winfrey Show received over 2 million emails and calls, divided almost equally between support and criticism. Major news outlets devoted hours to analyzing the confrontation. Religious scholars debated its implications. And quietly, in living rooms and coffee shops across America, people began asking the questions that had been raised. Clint Eastwood continued to decline all interviews. When pressed by reporters outside his ranch, his only comment was, "I said what I had to say. The rest is between you and God." Oprah Winfrey's journey continues. The questions remain. The search goes on.